The FBI doesn't lose sleep over the Hells Angels. They don't lose sleep over the bandidos, the outlaws, or the pagans. The club that keeps federal agents awake at night is smaller, leaner, and more willing to pull the trigger than any of them. This is the Mongols MC. And this is why law enforcement calls them the most dangerous motorcycle club on the planet. 13 Men and a Rejection, Montebello, California. A group of Hispanic Vietnam veterans walked up to a Hells Angels chapter and asked to join. They were turned away. The reason was never documented. It didn't need to be. The Hells Angels had maintained a whites-only membership policy since their founding in the 1940s. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't something leadership apologized for. It was simply how things were, and everyone in the California biker world understood it and accepted it as part of the established order. The men who got rejected that day did not accept it. They didn't go home. They didn't find a different club to prospect for. They didn't negotiate or appeal or try again. They sat down together and made a decision that would reshape the American outlaw motorcycle world for the next 5.5 decades. They were going to build their own club, on their own terms, with their own rules. And those rules would start with one principle that the Hells Angels had apparently never considered. The color of a man's skin says nothing about what he's willing to do for his brothers. They called it the Mongols Motorcycle Club, 13 founding members. The patch they chose depicted a Genghis Khan warrior, mounted, armed, riding at full speed. It was not a subtle choice. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous land empire in human history by refusing to accept any limit on what he could take. The founding members of the Mongols understood the metaphor completely. They were not here to be contained. They were not here to be told where they could and could not go. They were here to take what they decided was theirs. The early years were modest. The club was regional, Southern California, Latino membership, largely working class. Most of the founders were veterans, men who had served in Vietnam and come home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. They were too young to be celebrated as heroes of a popular war, too shaped by combat to fit easily back into civilian life. The military had given them structure, brotherhood, a sense of purpose. The club gave them all of that again, plus something the military hadn't, the freedom to answer to no one but each other. Nothing about those early years would have suggested to an outside observer that this was the beginning of something exceptional. They were one of dozens of motorcycle clubs operating across Southern California. They rode, they drank, they fought occasional turf battles with rival clubs, standard outlaw biker behavior. But something was different about the Mongols from the beginning, and it had nothing to do with how many members they had or how much territory they controlled. It had to do with what they were built on. Every other major outlaw motorcycle club in America was, at its core, a criminal enterprise that had adopted a biker identity. The Hells Angels sold drugs and extorted businesses and committed violence in service of protecting revenue. The bandidos in Texas did the same thing. The outlaws across the Midwest and South did the same thing. They were organizations that had found, through a combination of historical accident and deliberate choice, that the motorcycle club structure, the hierarchy, the loyalty codes, the geographic chapter network was an effective way to organize criminal activity. The Mongols were not that. Not at the beginning. The Mongols were built around a wound, a specific, personal, institutional rejection. The violence and criminality came later, grew organically from the nature of the world they operated in. But the founding energy, the thing that gave the club its identity, its mythology, its reason for existing, was not criminal ambition. It was defiance, the refusal to be told what they were and were not allowed to be. Think about what Montebello looked like in 1969. The neighborhood sat in the eastern edge of Los Angeles County, home to a predominantly Mexican-American population that had been shaped by waves of immigration and shaped further by a war that had pulled young men from those communities into jungle combat in Southeast Asia and returned them, changed, to streets that hadn't changed at all. The veterans who founded the Mongols were not unusual men in their community. They were representative. Young, Latino, military-trained, underemployed, and living in a country that had used them and didn't particularly know what to do with them now that the using was done. The motorcycle was not incidental to any of this. For veterans of that era, the motorcycle represented something specific: freedom of movement. control over your own trajectory, the ability to go wherever the road went without asking anyone's permission. It was also, in the context of 1960s and early 1970s California, a cultural statement, an alignment with a certain kind of America that rejected the suburban conformity that had been sold to the post-war generation as the reward for service. When the founding members of the Mongols were turned away by the Angels, they didn't just lose an opportunity to join a club. They received a clear message about where they stood in the hierarchy of a world they had already decided they wanted to be part of. The message was, not here, not you, not your kind. They built their answer to that message into the name of the organization they founded, the Mongols, conquerors, men who took what they decided was theirs and kept moving. That distinction sounds philosophical. In practice, it is operational. A club built around criminal enterprise will, when the enterprise becomes sufficiently costly, when the arrests and prosecutions and asset seizures pile up beyond a certain threshold, eventually calculate that the cost of continuing exceeds the benefit. Criminal organizations can be dismantled by making crime sufficiently unprofitable. That's the theory behind RICO prosecutions, behind asset forfeiture, behind the sustained federal pressure that has been applied to organized crime in America since the 1970s. You cannot apply that logic to an organization built around defiance, because the entire point of the organization is to refuse to yield. The entire mythology of the club, the story the founders told, the story that every member since has been told, the story that defines what wearing the patch means, is about refusing to accept a rejection that was imposed by force. Taking apart the organization through legal and financial pressure doesn't defeat that story. It confirms it. Every federal operation against the Mongols is, from the club's internal perspective, more evidence that the world is trying to stop them. And the world has been trying to stop them since the beginning, and they are still here. That is the foundation of everything that follows. The bottom rocker that lit the fuse. To understand why the war started, you have to understand what a bottom rocker means. In the outlaw motorcycle club world, a patch has three components. The top rocker identifies the club by name. The center patch carries the primary logo. The bottom rocker identifies territory. It says where the club operates. It says where the club belongs. Claiming a bottom rocker that says California was, in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, understood by every club operating in the state to mean exactly one thing. You had the Hells Angels' permission. The Angels had claimed California so completely, had embedded themselves so thoroughly into the state's biker culture, that wearing California on your back without their blessing was an act of open aggression. Not a misunderstanding, not a cultural difference. Aggression, deliberate and understood by all parties as such. At some point in the mid to late 1970s, Mongols members started wearing a California bottom rocker. Nobody asked the Angels, nobody offered tribute, nobody sent a representative to negotiate. The Mongols simply started wearing the patch. They rode into Angels' territory wearing it. They showed up at Angels' frequented events wearing it. They did not hide it, did not minimize it, did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. A declaration. The Angels responded the way they had always responded to challenges to their territorial authority, with violence. Members of both clubs were attacked at rallies. Bodies of Mongols members appeared. Bodies of Angels members appeared. The police began tracking incidents they eventually filed under the heading of motorcycle club-related violence. Highway rest stops, casino parking lots, bar parking lots, residential streets. The violence was frequent enough to be a pattern and disciplined enough, on both sides, to avoid the kind of mass casualty event that would force a serious law enforcement response. For a while, the thing that law enforcement consistently underestimated in the decades-long conflict between the Mongols and the Angels was the Mongols' genuine indifference to the cost of continuing it. The Angels had advantages in the conflict that should have been decisive. They had more members. They had more chapters across more states. They had deeper criminal revenue streams to fund operations. They had a network of relationships with other major clubs, affiliates, and criminal organizations that gave them resources the Mongols couldn't match. On paper, the Mongols should have lost, should have been absorbed, neutralized, or eliminated within a few years of the first real clash. They weren't. Every escalation by the Angels produced a counter-escalation from the Mongols. New members joined. Existing members doubled down. The culture of the club, which had been forged in rejection from the beginning, processed each new attack as additional confirmation that the fight was worth having. You cannot negotiate with an organization whose identity depends on refusing to negotiate. The Angels eventually understood this. By the time the most infamous moment of the conflict arrived, in the spring of 2002, the war had been running for nearly 30 years. Neither side had blinked. Neither side had backed down, and both sides were about to be forced into a confrontation that neither one fully controlled. Laughlin, Nevada. The 27th of April, 2002. The Laughlin River Run draws tens of thousands of motorcyclists to the Nevada desert town each spring. It is one of the largest rally events in the American Southwest. Hotels fill weeks in advance. The casinos along the river run open bars and special events. It is loud, chaotic, commercially driven, and because it draws thousands of riders from across the country, including members of rival clubs, monitored closely by law enforcement every single year. In 2002, that monitoring proved insufficient. The incident that has since been referred to as the Laughlin riot began inside Harrah's Casino in the early morning hours of April 27th. The exact trigger depends on which account you read. Arguments started. Words were exchanged between Mongols and Angels members who found themselves in close proximity in the casino restaurant. The details of who said what to whom have never been definitively established in any legal proceeding. What is not in dispute is the timeline of the next 4 minutes. The argument moved from the restaurant to the gaming floor. Other members of both clubs, spread across the casino, moved toward the disturbance. Within 60 seconds of the first physical contact, the brawl had engulfed a substantial portion of the casino interior. Chairs were used as weapons, pool cues. At least one person was stabbed. At least 3 firearms were discharged inside the casino building. The noise was loud enough that guests on multiple floors reported hearing what they thought was construction or an equipment malfunction. By the time the first casino security personnel reached the gaming floor, 3 men were down with gunshot wounds, 2 Mongols, 1 Hell's Angel. 17 additional people were treated for injuries at the scene, including casino guests who had no affiliation with either club and no way to have anticipated that the table they had chosen for a Tuesday evening dinner would end up in the middle of a criminal gang war. All 3 shooting victims died. Nevada Highway Patrol deployed riot response units. The casino was placed under immediate emergency lockdown. Emergency medical personnel set up a triage area in the parking lot. Law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions flooded the area. The casino, which had been doing normal Tuesday evening business minutes earlier, looked, within the hour, like a crime scene from a war zone. It was on national television the next morning. What the television coverage did not adequately explain, what most coverage of the Laughlin incident has never adequately explained, is the degree to which the brawl was neither planned nor spontaneous. It was the product of a decades-long war being conducted in a space that both clubs had chosen to occupy simultaneously, with sufficient numbers of members in close enough proximity that the specific trigger barely mattered. Laughlin was going to happen somewhere. The only question was where and when. Both clubs had hundreds of members attending the rally. Both clubs had members who had been in prior confrontations with members of the other club. The casino was a pressure cooker, enclosed, alcohol-saturated, full of men who had spent years learning to interpret certain looks, certain words, certain movements as preludes to violence. In that environment, with that history, in that specific configuration, the outcome was not inevitable in the sense that it was planned. It was inevitable in the sense that the conditions produced it. That is, in some respects, the most frightening aspect of the Laughlin story. Not that 2 clubs deliberately chose to have a gunfight in a crowded casino, but that the accumulated weight of 30 years of war created a situation where 3 people died and 17 were injured without anyone in the room having made a decision to start killing that night. And that is the part that changed everything. The national news covered it the next morning, and suddenly, the Mongols were not a regional law enforcement problem. They were a story. Their name was on television. Federal agencies that had been watching them from a distance began moving closer. Congressional staffers started asking questions about outlaw motorcycle club violence. The ATF, which had been building intelligence files on the Mongols for years, started getting resources that hadn't been available before. Laughlin was the worst thing that could have happened to the Mongols' public profile, and it changed nothing about how they operated. That's the detail that law enforcement found genuinely alarming. Not the brawl itself. Organized crime generates violence. That's expected. What alarmed investigators was the aftermath. The Mongols' members involved in the Laughlin brawl returned to their chapters. They showed up at their regular meetings. They wore their patches in public. They didn't hide, didn't scatter, didn't show any behavioral change consistent with an organization that understood it had just made itself the target of a major federal investigation. Either they didn't know what was coming, or they didn't care. The evidence of everything that came after suggests the second: Operation Black Rain and the battle over the patch. The ATF does not move fast. That is not a criticism. It is a description of how serious long-term infiltration operations work. You do not rush an undercover agent into a motorcycle club the week after a high-profile incident and expect the operation to produce prosecutable intelligence. You build. You identify entry points. You develop cover identities that can withstand scrutiny. You recruit informants from inside the organization or develop agents capable of passing as genuine members. You wait. Operation Black Rain was authorized in 2005. It took 3 years to build before it was ready to execute. In October 2008, coordinated raids across multiple states produced 77 arrests. The seizures were substantial: methamphetamine, cocaine, firearms, including illegal automatic weapons, and cash. Federal racketeering charges were filed against dozens of members and associates. The centerpiece of the prosecution was Ruben Doc Cavazos, the national president. Cavazos was an unusual figure in the outlaw biker world. He held an advanced academic degree. He had spent years before his arrest attempting to reposition the Mongols' public image, giving media interviews, writing a memoir, arguing publicly that the club was a legitimate motorcycle organization whose members happened to include some individuals with criminal histories. Federal prosecutors spent the trial demonstrating the distance between that public positioning and what the surveillance and wire recordings actually showed. Cavazos was convicted. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. The club did not collapse. New officers were elected before Cavazos had been processed into the federal prison system. New protocols were implemented based on the specific vulnerabilities the operation had exposed. The organization adapted. And here is the metric that investigators found most difficult to explain to congressional oversight committees. Mongols' membership did not decline after Operation Black Rain. It increased. Then, prosecutors pushed further. They asked the court for something unprecedented. In the course of the Black Rain sentencing, federal prosecutors argued that the Mongols' patch, the logo, the name, the complete visual identity of the club should be classified as a criminal instrument and confiscated from every member, not just those convicted of crimes. The argument was novel and, from the government's perspective, elegant. The patch was what gave the Mongols their criminal power. It was the signal, the brand, the thing that made the name mean something in criminal markets. Strip it away, and you strip away the operational advantage the club had built over 4 decades. The defense argued that the patch was protected expression, that a membership organization's collective identity could not be confiscated as a criminal punishment without violating the First Amendment. The trial court ruled for the government. The Mongols appealed. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling. The patch was protected. It could not be taken. The legal victory reverberated through every chapter immediately. It became the story, the specific piece of the club's history that leadership pointed to when explaining to new members what the Mongols were and why they had survived what no other club had faced. We went to federal court over our right to exist. We won. In a culture where respect is the only currency that matters, winning a constitutional battle against the United States government is worth more than any amount of street credibility. The machine behind the myth. The violence is not the point. The violence is the evidence. What it is evidence of is the structure underneath. The Mongols operate through a chapter system that mirrors, deliberately and explicitly, military organizational models. The founders were veterans. They built what they knew. Local chapters have elected officers, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, sergeant-at-arms, who answer to regional leadership, who answer to national leadership. The lines of authority are explicit. The expectations of every level of the hierarchy are spelled out. The consequences of failing those expectations are understood by every member before they take the patch. This structure does two things simultaneously. First, it creates accountability. Members at every level know what is expected of them and what happens when those expectations aren't met. The internal discipline process, conducted in what club terminology calls church, a full chapter meeting, operates with enough procedural structure that federal intelligence analysts have described it, with some irony, as more formally organized than some civil court proceedings. An accused member presents his case, witnesses speak, the chapter votes, the outcome is enforced. Second, and more critically from a law enforcement perspective, the structure compartmentalizes information. A prospect knows almost nothing about the chapter's operations beyond what he can observe directly. A full patch member knows his chapter's business, but has limited visibility into other chapters. Regional officers know more, but even they operate with significant gaps in their knowledge of the full organizational picture. The complete picture exists only at the national level. This means that any federal undercover agent or informant who penetrates the organization at the chapter level, which is the only realistic entry point, can document chapter-level activity, but cannot provide the kind of comprehensive organizational map that RICO prosecution requires. Every successful infiltration operation has run into this wall. You can convict the people you can see. You cannot convict the organization because you can never see the entire organization from any single position within it. Former ATF Special Agent John Ciccone, who ran more operations against outlaw motorcycle clubs than any other federal agent in history, described this architecture in post-retirement interviews as the primary reason the Mongols had survived, everything law enforcement had thrown at them. He said, bluntly, that the Mongols had built a better organizational model than most of the law enforcement apparatus designed to dismantle it. That is not a small admission from someone who spent his career trying to put Mongols members in prison. The code of silence that reinforces this structure is not maintained purely through fear. Although fear plays a role, it is maintained through identity. Talking to law enforcement, in the Mongols' culture, is not just dangerous, it is a fundamental violation of what membership means. The patch is not just a logo, it is a commitment, a declaration of where your loyalty lies and what you are willing to sacrifice to honor it. Breaking that loyalty talking, cooperating, providing information to authorities is not something members do reluctantly under sufficient pressure. It is something members are genuinely, culturally, psychologically resistant to doing, regardless of pressure. That cultural resistance is the most significant operational advantage the Mongols possess. It cannot be targeted. It cannot be dismantled. It can only be waited out, and it has been waiting for 56 years. And here is the uncomfortable truth that experienced investigators will tell you when the cameras are off and the official statements have been made. The federal government has not found a way to wait it out. Operations end. Task forces get reassigned. Funding cycles. Political attention moves, but the Mongols are still there, still holding the same patch, still operating under the same code, still telling the same founding story to every new prospect who earns the right to hear it. The institution is more patient than the institutions trying to destroy it. That, more than anything else documented in 56 years of law enforcement files, is what makes the Mongols genuinely and enduringly dangerous. The global expansion, the conventional law enforcement assessment of the Mongols through the late 1990s was geographically limited. Southern California problem, regional criminal organization, contained by the Hells Angels' dominance elsewhere in California, by the Bandidos' territory in the Southwest, by the simple reality that expanding a criminal motorcycle club into new territory requires members willing to move and recruit and build something from nothing in an unfamiliar place. That assessment was wrong in a way that nobody fully recognized until the evidence of the expansion was already too large to ignore. The Mongols did not expand through a national strategic plan. There was no leadership meeting where officers drew lines on a map and decided to establish chapters in new states. The expansion happened the way organic growth happens in any organization, with a strong culture and a compelling identity. Individual members moved for personal reasons, work, family, opportunity. They took their patches with them. They found other men in their new locations who were interested. They started hang-around programs. They built small groups of prospects. They eventually requested formal chapter status from national leadership. The first expansion beyond Southern California was into the American Southwest and Mountain West, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico. Markets adjacent to California, connected by interstate highways that Mongols members were already riding regularly. By the early 2000s, there were chapters in the Midwest, Illinois, Ohio. By the mid-2000s, the South, Florida, Texas territory that the Bandidos considered their own. And then, around 2008 to 2010, something that federal agencies had not specifically prepared for: international chapters. Australia was first, or among the first. The Australian outlaw motorcycle club scene had been shaped for decades by domestic clubs with their own histories, and the Australian chapters of American clubs, the Hells Angels, the Bandidos, the Rebels. Australian Federal Police had built substantial intelligence networks around these organizations. They had task forces, surveillance capabilities, undercover programs. They understood the threat landscape as they had defined it. The Mongols arrived and changed the definition. Australian police officials who spoke to journalists and researchers in the years following the club's expansion described the Mongols as introducing a level of organizational sophistication that existing domestic clubs didn't match, and that the existing chapters of American clubs hadn't brought with them. The Mongols' chapter structure, their internal discipline, their culture of silence, all of it translated across the Pacific intact. The club didn't adapt to Australia. Australia adapted to the club's presence. Germany came next, and then the Netherlands, and then chapters appeared in Canada, in Mexico, in Southeast Asia. Each expansion created its own intelligence and law enforcement crisis. Each expansion demonstrated the same thing. The Mongols' identity was strong enough to cross borders, translate across languages, and take root in criminal environments that bore no surface resemblance to the streets of Montebello, California, where the whole thing began. By the early 2020s, the Mongols had become a genuine global criminal organization, not in the way that the international drug trafficking cartels are global, not through centralized control of supply chains that span continents, but in the way that the most durable criminal institutions are global, through culture, through identity, through a name that carries specific meaning in Melbourne and Amsterdam and Mexico City, the same way it carries meaning in Riverside, California. That brand is not measured in revenue, it is measured in what doors it opens, what threats it eliminates without being spoken, what respect it commands in rooms full of people who understand exactly what it signifies. That brand is the Mongols' most valuable asset, and unlike drugs or cash or weapons, it cannot be seized. The numbers behind the fear. The Mongols are not the largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world. That distinction belongs to the Hells Angels, which claims approximately 3,000 full patch members across chapters on 6 continents. The Bandidos, based in Texas, carry roughly 2,500 members worldwide. The Outlaws, predominantly concentrated across the American Midwest and South, run approximately 1,700. The Mongols, by most current intelligence estimates, have between 800 and 1,000 patched members in the United States and between 300 and 500 internationally across their chapters in Australia, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. Total global membership sits somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500. Depending on which estimate you use and how you count affiliate relationships, that makes them the 4th or 5th largest club by raw membership. So why do federal agencies treat them as the highest priority threat? The answer is in a metric that law enforcement does not publish publicly, but references consistently in internal briefings and after-action reports. It is sometimes called the Violence Index, a measure of documented violent incidents normalized by membership size and adjusted for the geographic territories each club operates in. By this measure, the Mongols are not just the most dangerous club, they are not close. They outperform every other major outlaw motorcycle club in documented per capita violence by a margin that experienced investigators describe, off the record, as significant. A smaller club with a dramatically higher violence index is more dangerous to communities, more dangerous to rival organizations, and more dangerous to law enforcement than a larger club with a lower one. The Mongols may have a third of the Hells Angels membership, but those members, on a per-member basis, generate more documented violent incidents than any comparable group of people operating under a single organizational identity in the American criminal landscape. That number is not the result of recklessness or disorganization. It reflects a club culture that treats violence as a first response to disrespect rather than a calculated last resort. In most criminal organizations, violence is a tool expensive, attention-attracting, and therefore reserved for situations where the benefit clearly outweighs the cost. In the Mongols, violence is also an identity statement. It is how the club communicates what it is. Every incident that doesn't get punished is a message that the club can be pushed. Every incident that gets answered is a message that it cannot. The operational consequence of that cultural position is a club that generates more legal exposure, more law enforcement attention, and more risk than its size would otherwise justify, and that has survived all of it for 56 years. Federal agencies, to their credit, understand this now. The Mongols' problem is not a volume problem, it is a culture problem, and cultures do not respond to the tools that work on organizational structures. 3 rivals and 1 cold truth. Every major outlaw motorcycle club in the United States has, at one point or another, found itself in conflict with the Mongols. The specific nature of those conflicts varies, but 3 rivalries have defined the club's external relationships more than any others. The Hells Angels, the Vagos, the Bandidos. The Angels rivalry is the one that started everything, and the one that, in terms of documented casualties and historical significance, dwarfs all the others. 5 decades, multiple confirmed deaths. 1 casino brawl that made national news. Dozens of smaller incidents that didn't. The conflict is so deeply embedded in both clubs' identities that even members who joined in the 2010s, long after the worst of the violence, carry the weight of it as foundational history. The Angels-Mongols relationship has been in a form of managed Cold War for the past decade or so. Not peace, neither side would use that word, but a reduction in active hostilities driven by pragmatic calculation. Both clubs, facing sustained federal attention, recognize that open warfare between 2 major organizations generates law enforcement resources and public attention that make infiltration easier. The operational logic of reducing conflict aligned, for once, with the financial logic. The truce, fragile and unacknowledged by either side publicly, has held. The Vagos rivalry is less famous outside law enforcement circles and more operationally significant inside them. The Vagos Motorcycle Club is demographically similar to the Mongols' predominantly Latino, Southern California roots, working-class membership, and occupies much of the same geographic territory. They are, in the most direct sense, competitors for the same market, in the same place. That produces a kind of conflict that is more constant and more granular than the Mongols' Angels' War, which was always as much ideological as territorial. Throughout the 2010s, Mongols-Vagos incidents occurred with a frequency that kept multiple ATF field offices occupied. The 2016 Operation Pure Luck, which targeted the Vagos but documented the rivalry extensively, produced testimony from an embedded informant that described a violent cycle so self-sustaining that members on both sides were being killed for incidents that predated their own membership. The cause of any given attack was often impossible to identify, because the attack was itself retaliation for a retaliation that traced back years or decades. The Bandidos are different again, the second largest outlaw motorcycle club in the world. Texas-based, internationally expanded, with their own documented federal history and their own code of silence and their own culture built around military veterans and working-class loyalty. In structural terms, the Bandidos are the club most similar to the Mongols. They have faced similar prosecutions. They have survived similar infiltrations. They have expanded internationally through similar organic processes, which is precisely why the relationship between them is not war. 2 organizations that deeply understand each other, that recognize the same patterns in each other's behavior, that respect each other's resilience, without necessarily respecting each other, exist in a state of competitive tension that is more useful to both parties than open conflict. They know where each other's lines are. They don't cross them unnecessarily. but they are watching each other at all times. When Mongols and bandidos appear at the same large rally, law enforcement deployments adjust. Not because violence is certain, because when organizations of that operational sophistication and that level of internal discipline share a space, everything that happens is intentional. Every interaction carries weight. The absence of conflict is as deliberate as the conflict itself. The files, they're still trying to crack. The ATF has run more undercover operations against the Mongols than against any other motorcycle club in American history. The cumulative intelligence produced by those operations, the surveillance footage, the wire recordings, the informant testimony, the financial analysis, fills federal file systems that are still being actively worked. Operation Ivan produced 63 arrests in 2000. Operation Black Rain produced 77 in 2008. Subsequent operations, some named and publicly documented, others kept under seal, have added to the total. The aggregate picture that emerges from all of that intelligence work is not the picture most people expect. The Mongols' criminal revenue is more diversified than a simple drug trafficking label suggests. Methamphetamine distribution remains documented and significant. But investigators have also consistently identified revenue from stolen motorcycle components and chopped bikes, from illegal weapons sales and trafficking, from extortion of legitimate businesses in territories the club controls, and from what federal intelligence files describe as security provision, essentially, charging other criminal enterprises for the use of the Mongols' name and the deterrent effect that name carries. That last category is, in some respects, the most sophisticated revenue stream. It requires no violence to function. It functions entirely on reputation. An organization that has built a name for extreme and reliable violence can monetize that name without committing any specific act. The threat is the product, and the Mongols have spent 56 years building the credibility that makes the threat worth paying for. The club's relationship with Mexican drug trafficking organizations, extensively documented in DEA and ATF intelligence files from the 2000s and 2010s, is consistently described as transactional rather than structural. Specific Mongols chapters, in specific geographic markets, developed working supply relationships with cartel-affiliated distribution networks. The arrangements were understood by both parties to be contingent on continued benefit. There was no formal partnership, no organizational merger, no hierarchy linking the two organizations. There were specific business deals between specific people, managed at the local level, producing specific revenue flows. This structure, decentralized, relationship-based, deliberately disconnected from the national club hierarchy, is extraordinarily difficult to prosecute. You can document a specific transaction. You cannot document an organizational policy, because there isn't one. It exists in the space between formal criminal enterprise and informal criminal cooperation, and American law has historically struggled to reach that space effectively. The federal government knows this. It has known it for decades, and the Mongols, entirely aware of where the prosecutorial limits lie, have operated carefully within them. What it takes to become one of them. Federal infiltration operations against the Mongols have failed more often than they have succeeded. That failure rate is not random. It reflects the specific structure of the Mongols' membership vetting process, which was designed not accidentally, but deliberately. Over decades of experience with law enforcement, infiltration attempts to identify people who don't belong. The process begins before any formal relationship exists. A man who wants to prospect for the Mongols begins as a hangaround. He shows up at events. He makes himself useful. He interacts with members without any expectation of reciprocity or recognition. The hangaround phase has no defined duration. It ends when the chapter's members have formed a collective opinion about the person, and not before. During this period, the hangaround is being evaluated continuously. Members are asking questions not necessarily to his face, but among themselves and through their networks. Who is this person? Who knows him? What is his history? Why does he want this? Those questions are not asked casually. The Mongols have caught enough law enforcement infiltrators over the decades that the vetting process has been repeatedly refined based on the specific techniques that past operations used. How an agent typically establishes a cover identity. What patterns of behavior distinguish someone performing a role from someone living it? What questions a genuine recruit asks versus what questions someone building a legal case tends to ask? The vetting process has evolved as a direct response to law enforcement methodology. It is, in the most literal sense, an arms race. If the chapter reaches a positive consensus, the hangaround becomes a prospect. A prospect holds formal associated status, but earns no vote, no rank, and almost no privileged information. He is given tasks. He is expected to complete them without complaint, without explanation, and without asking for credit. He is tested not through any formal evaluation, but through the continuous, unannounced assessment of his behavior over an extended period that can last a year or significantly longer. The tasks given to prospects are not random, they are calibrated. A prospect might be asked to drive a vehicle somewhere without being told what is in it. He might be asked to be present at a location at a specific time without being told why. He might be asked to handle a situation involving another person without being given details about the context. These requests serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They test the prospect's reliability, they test his discretion, they test his willingness to act on trust rather than information, and they create legal exposure. Because a prospect who has completed tasks that turn out to be criminal in nature is compromised. He cannot cooperate with law enforcement without implicating himself. And a man who cannot cooperate with law enforcement without self-incrimination is, by definition, one of the most trustworthy people in the room. This is not a coincidence. This is architecture. At the end of the prospecting period, the full chapter votes. Unanimity or near unanimity is required. A single strong objection from a senior member can end a prospecting period that has otherwise gone well. The chapter is choosing someone they will trust with their safety and their secrets. The standard is necessarily high, and because the standard is high, the people who pass it are genuinely invested not just in the club's activities, but in its identity. They have been waiting long enough and been tested hard enough that the patch means something real to them when they receive it. That emotional investment is the final layer of the Mongols' defenses against infiltration. A federal undercover agent who has spent a year as a prospect, assuming he survived the vetting process that long, which is itself a significant assumption, arrives at full membership, not as someone playing a role, but as someone who has spent a year being shaped by the role. The club's culture works on people. The brotherhood is real, even when the brotherhood is criminal. Men who have spent a year serving a chapter, earning the respect of its members, and building genuine relationships within it, are not psychologically in the same position as someone who started the operation. They have been changed by it. Several ATF undercover operations against outlaw motorcycle clubs have produced after-action reports that describe exactly this phenomenon. Agents who went in with clear operational objectives and strong professional identities and came out, months or years later, having developed genuine attachments to the men they were investigating. This does not mean the investigations failed, it means the culture is real. And a real culture, one that produces genuine belonging, is significantly harder to treat as a target than a collection of individuals engaged in criminal activity. This is what makes the Mongols difficult to infiltrate in a way that goes beyond their security protocols. The security protocols are a first layer, the culture is the second. And the culture, unlike the protocols, cannot be mapped, cannot be anticipated, and cannot be bypassed. The most dangerous Mongol in the world. You have been waiting for a name. Here is the answer, and it is going to be more unsatisfying than you want it to be, but it is more accurate than any name I could give you. There is no single most dangerous Mongol, and that is the entire point. Every criminal organization that concentrates power in a single person is vulnerable in a way that can be targeted. Remove the leader, and you test whether the institution can survive without him. Sometimes it can. Often, it cannot. The FBI has built 5 decades of RICO strategy around exactly this principle. Find the head, remove the head, watch what happens to the body. With the Mongols, that strategy has never worked cleanly, and it has been tried. Ruben Doc Cavazos went to federal prison in 2008. He had been the national president. He was, by any external measure, the most powerful individual in the organization. His removal should have created a leadership vacuum that destabilized the club. Instead, new officers were elected within months. The protocols improved. The club continued. David Little Dave Santillan led the organization through the aftermath of Operation Black Rain. He was eventually removed from leadership amid suspicions never proven in court that he had been compromised by law enforcement contact. The removal was internal, handled through the club's own processes, without external involvement. The club continued. Leadership has changed through death, imprisonment, voluntary departure, and internal discipline multiple times across 56 years. Each time, the organization has absorbed the change without structural collapse, because the structure is not dependent on any individual, it is dependent on the identity. The patch is what holds the Mongols together, not a person, not a revenue stream, not a specific criminal market. The identity of the organization, the founding story, the mythology of rejection and defiance, the 56-year record of surviving everything that has been thrown at it, is the connective tissue. It is what a member in Australia shares with a member in California who he has never met. It is what makes the code of silence function without needing to be spoken. It is what makes a man who has been a Mongol for 20 years still feel the obligation that membership carries, even after incarceration, even after his chapter has been dismantled by a federal operation, even when cooperation with law enforcement would make his personal situation significantly easier. The courts recognized this. In 2008, when the federal government argued that the patch itself should be confiscated, that the identity of the Mongols was a criminal instrument subject to seizure, the Ninth Circuit disagreed. The court said, in effect, that what the Mongols are cannot be taken, even by a government with unlimited prosecutorial resources and a genuine legal case against the organization's leadership. Think about the implication of that ruling for a moment. The judicial system, the institution specifically designed to impose consequence on criminal behavior, drew a line around the Mongols' identity and said, this far and no further. You can imprison individuals, you cannot imprison what they represent. That ruling is why the Mongols are the most dangerous motorcycle club on earth. Not because of how many members they have, not because of how much product they move or how much money they make. Because they have built an identity so durable, so self-reinforcing, so embedded in the foundational mythology of rejection and defiance, that the full institutional weight of the American legal system cannot reach it. There are men in federal prisons right now serving long sentences for crimes they committed as Mongols members. Some of them are still Mongols. The patch doesn't come off because a cell door closed. The identity doesn't dissolve because the government won a prosecution. Those men are still part of the organization, still connected, through the relationships and the code and the mythology they carry with them, to the brothers on the outside. And when they are released, and many of them will be released, they will return. The club will take them back, because you don't leave the Mongols. You carry them with you wherever you go. Consider the full scope of what has been attempted against this organization over 56 years, multiple major federal undercover operations, each requiring years of preparation and millions of dollars in resources. Hundreds of individual arrests, significant prison sentences for leadership at every level, international law enforcement coordination across at least a dozen countries, a landmark attempt to confiscate the club's trademark identity in federal court, congressional oversight hearings, joint task forces combining ATF, FBI, DEA, and local law enforcement resources that have collectively invested more man-hours investigating this single organization than most federal agencies spend on entire categories of crime. The sustained, institutional, multi-decade effort of the most powerful government on Earth, directed at a club that started with 13 people in a parking lot in Southern California, and the Mongols are still here, still recruiting, still expanding, still wearing the patch that a federal judge tried to take and couldn't, still telling the founding story to every new hangaround who shows up and wants to be part of something that the rest of the world has spent half a century trying to end. Ask yourself what that means, not about the Mongols, about the tools being used against them. Law enforcement is not failing because it lacks resources or capability or commitment. Law enforcement is running into a wall that it did not build and cannot move. The wall is the identity, the founding story. The refusal, embedded in the club's DNA from the first day in Montebello, to accept the judgment of any external authority about what they are allowed to be, You can police behavior. You cannot police identity. You can prosecute crimes. You cannot prosecute a mythology. And until the law finds a way to reach the thing that actually holds the Mongols together, not the drugs, not the guns, not the money, but the 56-year-old story of 13 men who were rejected and chose to answer that rejection by building something indestructible, the club will continue exactly as it has continued, through everything that has come before. The most dangerous Mongol is not a name. It is the idea that 13 veterans had in a parking lot in Montebello in 1969, when they were told they couldn't belong and decided that the correct response to that information was to build something that would make the question irrelevant. An organization defined not by what it has, but by what it refuses to give up. That idea is 56 years old. It has survived federal prosecution, leadership collapse, sustained infiltration, international expansion, a constitutional battle over its own right to exist, and an unbroken war with the most famous motorcycle club in the world. It is still wearing the patch, and until someone figures out how to put an idea in prison, the Mongols will still be riding. If this story gripped you, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We are telling the stories most fear to touch. Thank you for watching.